So the film that I chose to do my critical film analysis on is Never Been Kissed. This movie was released in 1999, stars Drew Barrymore and Michael Vartan. Drew Barrymore's character is Josie Geller. She's a copy editor working for a newspaper, but she really wants the opportunity to advance and become a writer. She keeps pitching ideas for articles to her boss, who just really doesn't have the faith in her. She's a very good copy editor. He just doesn't know if that'll translate into a writer's perspective. So he keeps giving these ideas out to various writers throughout the newspaper, and it really starts to hurt Josie's feelings because she wants that opportunity. So we cut to a scene in the movie where they're in a company meeting, and the big boss of the newspaper is going on a rant about how he realizes he doesn't know his own teenage son. And so he wants to send an undercover reporter to a high school to figure out what's going on with these kids these days. So he points to Josie and he says, "Josie Geller, you enroll on Friday." And so she goes back to high school. This is kind of an interesting concept for Josie because the first time that she was in high school 10 years prior, she was not part of the popular crowd. She was ostracized, she was bullied, she was, made fun of a lot. So, she's not really sure how to be one of the popular kids. She does go back to school. She poses as an undercover reporter, as a high school student. And she immediately befriends kind of the nerdy crowd. One gal, Eloise, immediately takes her in and is very kind to her, very sweet to her, very accepting, without knowing any information about her. She also kind of befriends her English teacher, Mr. Coulson, and she communicates very well with him, and it's because that part of her, the real part of her, connects with him. So anyways, the story goes on where Josie's just not getting any stories, she's not getting any leads, nothing really of substance to pitch to her boss and the big boss at the newspaper. So they tell her, you need to become friends with the popular kids. That's where the stories are, that's where this is gonna play out. And she just doesn't know how to do that. So her brother ends up going back to school undercover, doesn't tell her, he just kind of shows up one day and enrolls in school and immediately, is back in the popular crowd. But he was in the popular crowd when he was in school years prior as well. And so through his influence, he's able to get the popular kids to accept Josie. He starts telling them stories about, her dad invented this, we used to date, we're still really good friends, her family vacations in Europe for a month every summer, and it's through his influence that they start to see Josie in a new light. And so the story goes on, and Josie ends up blowing her cover at prom, in order to defend Eloise, the original girl that befriended her. And Mr. Coulson ends up being very, very hurt because he had fallen for her. He had developed feelings for her. And so she broke that trust. So after all this, Josie realizes, that most kids sacrifice bits and pieces of who they are in order to put up a front, to be accepted, into that popular crowd and considered cool. And so she decides that she's going to make amends for, the trust that she's broken, and luckily it's a romantic comedy, so it all ends well. But the three areas that I chose to explore further are the following. So the first is inclusion need. And inclusion need is discussed in our interpersonal communication textbook as a social need to feel a sense of belonging or mutual interest within relationship to others. And we see this, very prevalently throughout the movie. Josie has that need to be accepted into the popular crowd. While it was driven through, by being on assignment and being undercover, this was her do-over. This was her chance to go back to school and to feel accepted, to feel like she wasn't an outsider anymore. We also see this, there's a particular scene with Eloise and the most popular guy in school, Guy Perkins. Of course his name is Guy. But they pull up to the hangout spot, and Guy comes to the window and he says, "Hey, Alpo, don't you know the dog pound is down the street? Really, did you think that you could hang out with us?" And, Eloise, she kind of brushes it off and, "What makes you think I want to hang out with you anyway?" But her demeanor changes. And she becomes very quiet and very kind of defensive, and you see her facial expressions change. She's sad. She feels hurt, she deep down does want to feel a sense of belonging. One of the major consequences that we see with this concept is that the need to feel included can become a moral pitfall, if you're not careful. It can cause you to compromise your own values in order to be accepted. Josie, while she didn't necessarily compromise her own values, she played that role. She had to pretend that she was someone that she wasn't in order to gain that acceptance. The next part that I wanted to explore further was communication convergence. And our textbook describes that as the synchronization of one's vocabulary, speaking rate, and use of pauses with another as part of building that relationship. This is seen throughout the movie, obviously. Josie goes back to high school. She has to relate to those kids. She has to communicate on their level. So when she's speaking with them, it's very, hip, and she uses slang, and she kind of mimics their hand gestures and their body language. However, when she's speaking with Mr. Coulson, she's very poised. She's very put together. They have very deep conversation. And that's because, she's mirroring that. She's, in that sense, she's staying true to herself, and she's connecting with Mr. Coulson on that deep personal level. Whereas when she's, talking to the high school kids, she's mirroring their actions and their words and their phrases to fit in, and to build that relationship, to gain that trust. And so that brings us to trustworthy behavior. And our textbook talks about trustworthy behavior as a behavior that does not take advantage of another's vulnerabilities. And this is the concept that stood out the most for me within this movie. Yes, Josie was on assignment that required her to play a role to intentionally deceive those around her. However, this means that when she, when the truth came out and everyone saw who she was, she pretty much almost destroyed all of the relationships that she had built. Mr. Coulson was incredibly hurt because he felt that he had been taken advantage of, that he had been set up for a story. See if you can get the high school teacher to fall for a high school kid. That's a great story right there. He felt betrayed. But then the other kids within the school felt betrayed too, because they were being observed and they had no idea. So there were consequences with this too, the short-term consequences, especially for Josie's brother, Rob. He was back on the baseball team and doing really well, and she blew his cover too. And so, he kind of felt like his second lease on life, and his chance to do everything over, that was blown as a result of Josie kind of blowing her cover. She almost lost her job and her boss's job. Again, thankfully, this is a romantic comedy, so it all ends well. And all that trust was built back up, and, that was all through Josie being very honest and very vulnerable when she wrote her piece for the newspaper and just kind of detailed everything that she had been through and the realizations that she had. But all of this to say, the most important concept for this movie for me was trustworthy behavior, and always being true to yourself and being true in front of others. Don't play a part. we have this intrinsic desire to feel accepted and included, which can result in us not always being completely honest with everyone that we are around, or honest with ourselves. But we are called to be like Jesus. We're called to be honest and genuine and trustworthy. And so this movie, I think, really drives that home. And so it's one of my favorite movies, so I'm really glad that I got the chance to do a film analysis on it, and I hope that you enjoyed my presentation. Have a wonderful week. Merry Christmas. God bless.